American history in the watershed. And we have Mr. Peter Jemison, who, as some of you may already know, is the manager of the historic site at Canandaigua. And he has been in that position for around the last 11 years. He is also an artist, and he'll be filling in some of the details on how his work in art led him in some ways to what he's doing now. Maybe if you could hold your questions more toward the end, that would be helpful. Okay, thank you. We have about 3 more seats if you don't mind walking across.
I'll make sure everyone's seated.
One way back there when you came. Yeah. There's one seat up too.
Okay. Well, to begin with, I'll start in my native language, which is called by most people Seneca. In our own language, we refer to ourselves as Onundawaka, which means the people of the Great Hill. So my greetings are Nyawiskana Paguego, Winichio Negaminisa de. Onundawaka ni Hatagyonya ni Gyaso, Ganundagan ni Kanongi. Those words start by saying, now Paguego means that I give thanks that each of you are well. And when I say that, I'm talking about your, more or less your spiritual well-being versus your physical well-being. And then I say, Winichio Nangan Winisade. It's been a beautiful day out there. And also I said that Hatagyonya ni Gyaso, meaning my name from the Heron clan to which I belong is in the middle of the sky. And then I said, Banandagan ni Kanonge, meaning where I live in Ireland is a place known as Banandagan. And I guess I would finish that by saying Onundawak on me, meaning I am a person of the people of the Great Hill, meaning the Seneca. And that is how we introduce ourselves. And we talk, when we're talking to one another, we want to tell people a little bit about ourselves so they know where we're from. So I would use that same kind of introduction in our longhouse, because in our longhouse we use only our Seneca language when we are speaking. And so something like that could be used to announce who I am in a longhouse setting. I never know how many are going to be at these, and so I'm a little overwhelmed by the size. It's great to see everyone and see many familiar faces and friends that I've known in the past, so it's nice to see you all here. I brought along this evening some slides to help me with this introduction to our history, and I think unless I sit down here, I'm going to be standing in front of them, so I apologize that some of you may have to try to look over me as I'm talking about them. Just a little bit more about myself. To begin with, I am a member of the Seneca Nation. I grew up in a community known as Irving, New York, which is really right at the Cattaraugus Reservation, which is 35 miles to the south of Buffalo, New York. And I lived there until I was in high school, and graduated from high school. I went on to get a degree in art education, thinking my main interest would be to teach art. But as it's turned out, that's what I've done the least. I actually wound up teaching art for maybe a total of 4 years or something like that, as opposed to many other things I've done in that time period. But I continued in all those years to be an active artist and to show my work with other Indian artists, other contemporary artists. And that led me really to discovery, I think, of really who I am, and to question what it means to be a Seneca. And I was very fortunate that during that process of asking those questions that I have had very good teachers, many traditional people who preserve what I call our Indian way of life, have been kind enough to give me some education in the time period. And it's not the kind of education that you may traditionally think of, where you go to a school and you read a book or you take a test. But it is really an education where you take the time to go and speak to those people who preserve tradition. You take the time to attend our longhouse ceremonies, which is our traditional way of life at this point in time, or at least it's where it's carried out in a more religious setting. And in each of those cases, I felt that as I demonstrated my interest and my commitment to understanding, people were willing to share more with me and help me to understand who I am. So I guess to begin with, I'll just say just a few more words about that, and then I'll move on. You know, when you are born into this world, you know, you have this beautiful open slate that people can begin to help fill up or can begin to add some information to. And so for the first part of my education, I was in a classroom like this, you know, where people are teaching me in the English language, and they're teaching me the same sorts of things you learned, I'm sure. And the only difference maybe was I went to a very small school where there were 2 classes in each room, first and second in the same room, third and fourth in the same room, fifth and sixth in the same room, and so on. And I went there until about 6th grade, and then we centralized schools, and I went on to a bigger school with many more people. And in the environment I grew up in, the majority of people were Seneca. You know, for example, my parents were Episcopalians, and so with them I went to a church which was 99.9% Indian. The only non-Indian was the minister. And as time went along, there were a couple of women who married non-Indian men, and I remember that. But just otherwise, it was almost all Indian people in those kinds of communities. And I lived in this town, which was right at the edge of the reservation, and across the creek, literally, was the reservation. So I traveled back and forth almost on a daily basis because my cousins lived on a reservation, my grandmother lived on a reservation. To go and play basketball, we went over there. To go to church, we went over there. To visit my friends, I went there. So all of those reasons was kind of going back and forth between 2 worlds. And you would think that just this river, or this creek, we call it the Cattaraugus Creek, would not be such a big difference, you know, from one side of the creek to the other. But really, as I grew older, I found out what a great difference there really was between those 2 worlds that I experienced. But I really began to learn who I was as a Seneca when I got to be more an adult than as a child. But I am told that I had some great experiences as a child because there were some Seneca elders who, for various reasons, used to come and pick me up and take me home with them. And I spent time with those elders. And I think that that also left me with that impression that those are the kinds of people that I enjoyed listening to, or that I enjoyed talking to. I can only think that now. I don't even remember specific things that they taught me or specific things that we did, but I do remember all of them, you know, those people that my parents talked about as the ones who used to come and get me. So, for whatever reason, I feel I was very lucky and I had that experience with them. And so when I came to that question, after having gone through education of high school and then gone to college, gone out teaching, and finding myself feeling I don't exactly belong in this society, the society to which you all belong, I started asking myself, why do I feel like I don't belong? What's different about me? And I may look light-colored and I may look like someone who is not Indian, but inside of me was something else that I had to find out about. And that may be an experience that some of you have had if you identify with what your heritage is. So in looking for that answer, I took a long trip down through really a traditional way of life, and art was the access for me. Because I knew how to organize art exhibits, I knew how to organize art classes, I knew how to teach what I knew about art. And so I got those opportunities. I got invited to go home to the Cattaraugus Reservation and set up a program maintaining our traditional crafts and our traditional arts. And that introduced me to a lot of people who knew a lot of things that I wanted to know. So in the end, what I found was that when you say you're a Seneca, it means more than just a word. It's not just a name, I'm a Seneca. What it means is that you have a language. It means that you actually have a land base that is your land base, your original land, and that we're still living on our original land. That we actually have a way of life, which we in our language say, "Ongwe ongwe ta," an Indian way of life. There actually is that, and people are carrying it out. That there are songs, both social songs and ceremonial songs, that still exist, and dances that go with them, and we know those. That there are people who know about traditional medicines and still use those traditional medicines to interrupt illnesses, and people who can help you with that. That there's a knowledge of cooking, of plants that can be used in cooking. And all of these ideas, in addition to the crafts and the arts that we carry out, are still existing. And I think many people thinking about it say, after 500 years, how is that possible? How can these things still be? How can there still be a people who identify themselves as Seneca in a society which is more and more, I guess the word is homogeneous, more and more alike. And yet, of course, regionally there are great differences. And thinking there's great differences, but people think of people as, grew up with a television set, grew up in the television age or something like that. And I'm sure many of you recoil at those kinds of ideas of describing yourself that way. And so I had that journey to figure out what it means to be a Seneca. And some of this, what I'm going to talk about is what I've learned about that. And then we'll come around to what do we think, our philosophy. That's what I'll wind up with, and that's what we want to ask some questions. So probably if we have the lights off and we turn on some slides here, open up for you to speak. Can you tell if you're picking me up when this is here? It's all right? Okay, we'll get that focused. I can stand back a little bit from it. I start off by saying that every group of people has a creation story about how they came to be and where they come from, in other words. And we have a creation story, and in our creation story we talk about a world which existed above this world. And we at least talk about beings that were in that world. And those beings are described as being like us anyway. Whether they were exactly like us or different in what ways, we don't know. But we know that there were beings there who lived in that world. And at least two of them were a man and a wife. And there was a tree in this world, this upper world that they lived in, that was the source of all light for that world they lived in. And in a dream, this woman had, she thought that she needed to have that tree uprooted, and that if you did so, even more light would enter this world, or something would be revealed that was not known to them. The tree was not only a source of light, but it was a great source of food, apparently. Apparently it was a source of many different kinds of fruits, and a source of beautiful flowers as well. But her husband, against his better judgment, was talked into uprooting this tree. And in the process of doing that, a huge hole was revealed. And in this hole, there was a big, actually a nothingness almost, a big black area. But light coming from the tree itself, entering through that blackness below, showed down there, floating in space, a blue globe, or a blue ball at a great distance. And that blue globe is where we are now. But this woman got too close to the edge of this hole, and she fell through it. And as she plummeted through the air, it is said that below her there were water birds. And the water birds, seeing her flying through the air, rose up to catch her on their backs. Before falling, she reached back to try to catch herself, and she got a hold of some plants in her hands. So she came through the space with these plants in her hands. And these water birds conveyed her to the only dry spot in this globe, which was the back of a turtle. And they say it was a sea turtle that she landed on. Well, the sea turtle was not very large. It was really not big enough to support the woman, even who landed on its back. And so they began to think, those beings that lived in the water there where she was, how could they take care of her needs? And some of these water animals said, we'll dive to the bottom of the water and we'll bring up some earth and we'll build up the back of the turtle. And so one succeeded. Some say it was a tiny muskrat that was able to go to the very bottom and bring up in his tiny paw just a little bit of dirt that he placed on the back of this sea turtle. The woman walked about the back of the turtle, and as she did, she spread that dirt all over the turtle's back. And as she did this, the turtle grew and grew in size until it formed what we call today North America, and we in our language say Turtle Island when we talk about it. We're talking about an island as North America truly is. And this woman who came, she eventually gave birth to a daughter. And the daughter, in time, the story goes, mated with the west wind. And from that union came two twins. One who was born in a natural manner, and one who was born in an unnatural manner and came out through the armpit of his mother and caused the end of his mother's life, brought about the end of her life. And these two twins are the twins that will make the earth in the manner in which we know it now. One of them is going to go about making strawberries and going about making flowers and going about making the rivers to flow and going about to make the rose petals, and the other is going about and sort of undoing some of the things that his brother does. One might be going about and making the water and the rivers, and another is going about and he's putting in there rocks, jagged rocks, to make it very difficult to travel that river. Another is putting the thorns, that brother is putting the thorns on the rose bush so that it makes it difficult to go and get those roses. Or the thorns that are on the blackberry bush and you try to go and pick the blackberries at this time of the year. The brother that was born unnaturally is the one that we said did that. So what it kind of talks about in this creation story is that there are two forces in the world at all times. There's a force for good, for positive things, and there's a force for the negative, a force for the bad side. Or within us, within human beings, we have that capacity for good and for evil, and these forces exist at all times, and you just acknowledge that they exist, but you're now trying to find a way to walk in balance. So this painting that I used to introduce that idea is done by a man named Erwin Printup, and he's a Tuscarora from the Tuscarora community that is located near Lewiston, New York. Next slide, please. And this is one of my paintings, and it shows the turtle on which the woman landed, and we refer to her as Sky Woman. And now Sky Woman has, left this area. We don't see her, but in the rest of the story, when the mother is buried in the ground, these plants that the Sky Woman brought with her come up, and there are 4 of them that really grow. There's corn, there's beans, and there's squash, and we refer to those as the 3 sisters, or in our language, Joheko. And what that means is they sustain us, they provide for us. And then there's a 4th, which is tobacco. And it's not the tobacco that people are arguing about whether it causes cancer or not. It's a tobacco that is an Indian tobacco that is used just for our purposes, for our ceremonial use. It is not used as a recreational or a smoke or something like that. So these 4 plants, we say, came with her. Now the others, as I said, are put here by these 2 brothers. And they're constantly testing each other's power, which has got the more power, which is the more powerful of the 2 beings. And so I used here a butterfly and a lizard to indicate these 2 forces, not that either one is good or one is evil, but just most people kind of react to the reptile versus the butterfly. The butterfly they see is beautiful. Except if you come from a place like New Zealand where they had lots and lots of lizards and not much else. And so people there identify with those. And see them as a very positive sign when they see them. Now, in time, this tree that's in the center of this painting is going to become important to us, and it's a white pine tree. We use that as our symbol. In classrooms like this, you sometimes see a flag, an American flag, which is the symbol of your country. The symbol of our confederacy, the Iroquois Confederacy, or the Haudenosaunee as we call ourselves, is a white pine tree. Its needles grow in clusters of 5, like our 5 original nations: Seneca, Cayuga, Onondaga, Oneida, and Mohawk, our 5 original nations. We can change the next one. There's discussion about where do we come from? And as Senecas, where do we come from? And people point to 2 different hills. This is one of those hills that people point to, and it's called South Hill. And many of you are familiar with it, I'm sure. It's down on Lake Canandaigua, on the southeast side of Lake Canandaigua. As I said, our name is Onondaga, people of the Great Hill. So some have argued that it's this hill. The next slide, please. I think there's one more in here. And some have argued that it's that hill, which is Bear Hill, and that's where we come from. The person who has, I find, written the most about this in years gone by was a person who was part Seneca himself. His name was Arthur Parker, and he was the first director of the Rochester Municipal Museum, and eventually also a director of the New York State Museum. And Parker came to believe, after he lived in Naples for a number of years and did a lot of research and a lot of excavating around the area, that South Hill was more likely than Bear Hill. He ruled out Bear Hill because he couldn't find artifacts that he felt related to the Seneca. He felt that they related to another group of people. And so we'll leave that argument where it is, but some of you have heard the story of Bear Hill, the serpent that appears to a young boy. It's taken home and grows to an enormous size and begins to devour the people of this community that lived on top of Bear Hill. And so that story has been associated with that, and has been associated therefore with our people. But nevertheless, one of these 2 hills is really where we come from, we believe. And when we say Onondaga, we mean people of the Great Hill. Next slide, please. Very fortunately for us, there have been a series of messengers that have come among our people with instructions. We believe instructions from our Creator about how we're supposed to live. And we think that there's been a total of about 4 different messengers that have come at different times. And each time the new messenger came, the messenger repeated the previous messages so we wouldn't lose sight of those, and then also added a new message. So the very first messenger that came to us, he came with a message about ceremonies. And he came with a message that there were 4 ceremonies that are important to us that we should carry out. Excuse me, I'm going to back up. I misspoke. The first messenger that came to us came with a message of thanksgiving. This message about how we are to give thanks for all of the things that we see about us. The next messenger who came with this message about the ceremonies. That first messenger talked about how to go about giving thanks. And we have an entire speech that opens every single ceremony, and we call it in our language ganonyo. And what it does is it takes into account everything you see in the natural world and mentions it, and literally says, and now we give thanks, and our minds are one. And the intonation of everyone who is at that gathering, or the men especially, is nyo, meaning yes, it is good. So we open every ceremony with this thanksgiving, and we start off by giving thanks for the people, by the way. And so that was the first message we got. The next one is this one about the 4 ceremonies we're supposed to carry out and how to carry them out. But before he went into the ceremonies, he again emphasized giving thanks for all of the gifts, water, for example, all different kinds of water that we have. The next messenger who came to us came at a time when we were going through terrible conflict. We were fighting with one another. We were fighting within our families. We were fighting within our nation. And we were fighting among our nations. We could not get along. It was a time when people were afraid to be in their own community. It was a time of great destruction and great sorrow. And it might be like parts of the world where we can think of now, where conflict seems to be a part of daily life. That's what this world was like here
for our people. Until this man came that I show here, his name is the Peacemaker, we call him the Peacemaker, and he came among our people with a message of peace, power, and righteousness. And he showed us how to settle our differences by using our minds and putting away the weapons of war. And so we owe a great debt to him. But before he gave us that message about peace, he reminded us of giving thanks, and then he mentioned that we should also keep these 4 ceremonies up, and then he went into his long message called the Gaianis Hatgor, or the Great Law, how we're to live. So that messenger, this third messenger, we think he came among our people and united our 5 nations about 1,000 years ago. So that's when we think the Confederacy, known as the Iroquois to you, Haudenosaunee to us, was created about 1,000 years ago. Following that messenger, a 4th messenger came around 1799. He received a message from the Creator about how we are to live now. We, meaning Senecas, now that our European brothers and sisters are here, and now that the African American is here, and now that another group of people is going to come that we really hadn't even seen yet, but the yellow man is going to come. And so we were aware in all these different times that new people were coming to our shores, and now we had to consider, how do we live here now that these people have come? And that's what this message was, the 4th message, and we call that a gailio, where it's a great idea, a big message. And so before he gave us that, he reminded us of giving thanks, he reminded us of the 4 ceremonies, and he reminded us that we were united by law under this Confederacy. And then he gave us the new message. So these 4 times, and this man here is one of those who helped us. The next slide. This is a painting by John Fadden, by the way. And there's that word I was using, Gaianis Hatgor, or the Great Law. It's the law. So what I want you to understand, and I won't spend a lot of time on it, is that we have our own system of law. We actually have our own system of laws. Those laws have been in place for our people for at least 1,000 years. And they are to be used by our leaders, which you call chiefs, we would say sachem, or hoyane, which really means their responsibility is to uphold the peace. That's what it means. And what it means is you look out for the people that you're responsible for. Next slide, please. A woman played a very significant role at the time that the peacemaker came, because the very first person to take a hold of that message of peace, power, and righteousness was a woman. And this woman we call Jemison, meaning, and we refer to her as the Mother of Nations, because she took a hold of that message first. And by doing so, she earned for our women, back 1,000 years ago, responsibilities that they still have until today. First of all, we are a matrilineal society. I'm a Seneca because my mother is Seneca. Regardless of the fact that my father happens to be a full-blood Seneca, my mother's mother was Seneca, therefore my mother is Seneca, therefore I am Seneca. So that's how we trace our lineage. Also, we take the clan of our mother. My mother is a Heron, therefore I'm a Heron clan member. That's how we identify ourselves. My father, on the opposite side of the clan system, is a Wolf clan member. So I don't have my father's clan name. I have his last name, Jemison, but as far as the clan identity and my nation, that comes because of my mother. And we have those sachems I talked about, or hoyane, that lead our people. Behind every one of them is a woman, a clan mother, who is responsible for seeing that he acts in the best interest of the people. So the women have that ability to monitor his actions, also to even remove him after 3 warnings, to remove a leader if he's not acting in the best interest of the people. So women have great responsibilities. And so we would say that they had this power of the vote very early on. And it influenced the suffragettes. Matilda Gage and others like her, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, got to know Onondaga women, they got to know some Cayuga women, and those women they saw had rights. They also saw that they dressed in a very comfortable way, that they didn't wear tight-fitting corsets, that they ate foods that they grew in their own garden, and that they had a way to communicate to men about those things that they wanted done in their community. And they played a very powerful role in influencing those women, those Onondaga and Cayuga women that met them. There's a woman who's been researching this by the name of Sally Roche Wagner, and she's written quite a bit about it. It's very interesting, and most of you probably haven't heard this idea before, but it's something that is quite available. The next slide, please. Yes, go ahead and open the door. A little warm here. Okay, now where did we come from and where are our original territories? And so I'm going to just point those out. This Seneca territory, this far on my right here, in common with the Cayuga Nation. But in general, this is where our villages were to be found. So that's why they say that's Seneca territory, and then they draw these lines around it. But understand, those are not our boundaries. Those are boundaries that are created later on when someone is trying to teach our history. After 1655, though, this, what is called the western edge of our boundary, extends way, way out to where the Mississippi and the Ohio River come together. We go as far as that when we talk about the hunting territories of the Seneca Nation. So that's a large tract of land compared to what you're seeing here. The next slide, please. And this shows you the Mohawk territory, which was roughly bounded on the east by the Hudson River. So there's your Hudson River, and next to them the Oneida Territory. But you can see that the Mohawk territory went well up into the Adirondack Mountains, and is a very vast area of land that the Mohawk people actually occupied and used for hunting purposes. The next slide, please. With the majority of their settlements, of course, in more recent times, a couple hundred years ago, being along the Mohawk Valley, the Mohawk River. I've mentioned clans, and so I want to show you 4 clans which are on the bird side. I have this sign to illustrate them. So the 4 clans on the bird side are heron, hawk, snipe, and deer. The deer would be the odd one there because it is an animal, and some say it was a killdeer, not the deer, the animal, but a killdeer. And in time, the animal has taken over as the symbol for that clan. So you have these 4 on this side. Imagine, if you will, there's a fire in between, and on this side there are 4 animals. And so it would be snapping turtle, wolf, beaver, and bear. And these are the animal side of the clan system. And just quickly, the way that works is you don't marry within your own clan, and ideally, if you're going to marry, the woman you marry is across the fire among the animals. And that way you do not marry your cousins, because all the members of the Heron clan are my extended cousins, are related to me in some manner. And it's amazing how closely that works. I mean, we really are related when we look back at it. So to keep that from developing traits in ourselves that we didn't want, we had developed this system to marry across the clan system. But the other thing that it's important for is when someone passes on this bird side of the clan system, and when you are in a state of grief and you cannot deal with day-to-day activities, the people on the animal side come in and take care of all of those responsibilities, like having food at the home, like taking care of some of the arrangements that you do not want to deal with. They take care of all those. So that's one way in which our clan system works. It's just one way. Next slide. We conceive of ourselves as a longhouse. When we say Hodino Sani, it means people of the longhouse. And we don't just mean the building we lived in, but we also mean the entire length of the state of New York. Senecas, keepers of the western door; Cayuga, Onondaga, keepers of the central fire; Oneida, Mohawk, keepers of the eastern door. And so each nation had its own fire, and the earth is our floor, the sky is our roof, and these doorkeepers have specific responsibilities. Nations that want to communicate with us from the west come through the Seneca door. That's the way in which you do it in a formal manner. The next slide, please. For a very long time, Onondaga never ever met, a non-Indian person, never met the white man. And so when they first met him, they saw him on horseback. And an artist, some 300 years ago, made this comb out of moose antler. The size of it, it would actually fit in the palm of your hand. That's how big that is. blown up on the screen here. It looks very different. But this is the first time they saw this man named Wentworth Greenhall, who rode from around Albany up through our territories and did a kind of an inventory. He counted people, and he counted our homes. And when he came among the Seneca, who were then living at this historic site that I managed, known as Ganondagan in Victor, New York, he said he saw 150 bark longhouses, and he saw perhaps as many as 4,500 people. If you took the number of people who could potentially live in a longhouse times 150, you could have seen as many as 4,500 people living there in 1677, and maybe even more. And that population might have been half of what the original population was, because the original population of people was almost halved by European diseases to which we had no natural immunities, including smallpox and influenza. Some of our populations were reduced by as much as 2/3, and some were reduced by as much as a half because of those diseases. So when he came through, he perhaps saw half of what had once been living in that town not too many years before that. So this is a depiction of Wentworth Greenhall by a Seneca artist. The next slide. I think I failed to mention that depiction of that woman was done by Stan Hill, who's a Mohawk artist. Now, when the European begins to make contact with us, the way in which they made contact with us was through the fur trade system. People were bringing in guns, gunpowder, glass, brass, copper, rum was introduced at that time, and in exchange, we were giving them the beaver. And that's what's depicted here on this particular comb, is the beaver. That was the main item that people from France, Holland, and England wanted. And what did they want it for? Not to make a fur coat. They took that beaver back to England or to Holland or wherever, and they pulled off the guard hairs, the longest hairs on the pelt, got down to the hairs next to the hide, which were the finest. They took those off, they put them on a screen like the screen you used to keep the flies out of the house, and then they added a sizing, and they made a felt rug, or a felt oval shape, and from that they fashioned a hat. And so thousands and thousands of beavers went back to Europe to be turned into hats. And the more hats you sold, the more money they made, and these European countries literally built their empires on the sale of these hats. It's almost impossible to believe at this point in time, but you'd have to see it as being comparable perhaps to, what we now send and market to the world. We're marketing the United States entertainment, the CD, the rock and roll, the whatever. And they're sending over here Sony television sets. Okay, the next slide, please. I mentioned that we had 3 sisters, right? Corn, beans, and squash, and we called them Joheiko. Well, that's how we survived. We were not just hunters. The women were the agriculturalists, and the women raised these 3 crops. At Ganondagan, in 1687, an army came to wipe us out, and when they arrived there, they reported that they destroyed something in excess of 1 million bushels of corn in trying to defeat us. Over 1 million bushels of corn. Those of you who are farmers in this room or know anything about farming realize any group of people who can put together 1 million bushels of corn is a very organized group of people, especially when you consider there were no domestic animals. Women did the agricultural work with the assistance of men, but it was all done by hand. And so what they destroyed was what was growing in the fields, and what they also found in bark silos being dried, and also in a fort where it was being protected by being buried in the ground inside of bark containers. So between growing corn and stored corn, the French recorded in 1687 that they destroyed over 1 million bushels of corn. That same tactic of trying to wipe us out would be used, the next slide please, would be used 92 years later by the Sullivan Campaign. The Sullivan Campaign was the American army at the direction of George Washington coming through our territories again, trying to annihilate us, and when they didn't succeed, they decided that the best way to do it was to burn and destroy anything we could eat. They reported destroying hundreds and hundreds of acres of corn growing more than 12 feet tall. They reported destroying the best apple orchards, the best peach orchards, and plums that they had seen in their entire journey from Pennsylvania to this point, from down around eastern Pennsylvania to here. They saw the best when they got into the Geneva, Canandaigua, and this whole rich area of growing here in the Finger Lakes. And the Continental Army was essentially broke. They had no money, and so the way in which they were going to be repaid by Washington was through land. And where do you suppose those people wanted to live after seeing what they saw growing here? So your ancestors in this room, some of you, may have been some of those people who came to this area because of the rich agricultural tradition that was here for hundreds and hundreds of years prior to the arrival of Europeans. And so, remember, corn, beans, and squash begin here, and they go literally all over the world. There was no corn in England, there was no corn in Asia, there was no corn in Africa before corn left here. And all these varieties of beans, and many, many other fruits and vegetables that you take for granted actually come from Turtle Island, or come from Central America and South America. Next slide, please. Where I work today is this place called Ganondagan, corner of Victor Holcomb and Boughton Hill Road, 1 mile south of the center of the village of Victor, New York. We're living in the electronic age, aren't we? Every few minutes, somebody's alarm goes off, reminding them to, next slide. No, it's watches. People are on a timer here.
I think it might be somebody's got a purse. They got anything? I don't know if it's coming out of here. I didn't really want to touch the purse.
Okay.
I'm not
This
trying
is
to
our visitor
make any
center at
money.
Ganondagan, and it is a building which was built in around 1823, a very small building, but it's used as our visitor center at Ganondagan. So if you come to Ganondagan, you'd want to come to this building first to pick up information about the trails that are there and see a 27-minute introductory videotape. Next slide, please. And the first trail we have on top of the hill is called the Trail of Peace, and gives a lot of this background that I'm talking about here. It talks about the town of Ganondagan, and it also talks about this message of peace that came from the peacemaker. The next slide, please. And then we have a trail that seems to be one of the favorites for people that come to visit Ganondagan, and that is a trail that goes through the woods. It's called the Earth is Our Mother Trail. And that is really something that is a part of our way of life, our way of thinking, that the earth is our mother, and that everything that you and I need to depend on to live comes from the earth, is provided to us by our mother. And so on this trail we identify trees and plants by their Seneca name, their Latin name, and also their English name. And so, for example, this tree here is called, in the Seneca language, jogakas. Anybody tell me what kind of a tree it is? Hickory. What kind of hickory?
Shagbark.
Very good. Very, very good. Yes, that's a shagbark hickory. And the ideal thing you can make from a shagbark hickory, a little smaller than this one, for us, is a lacrosse stick. Makes an ideal lacrosse stick. Can make the cane that you need to walk with, the handles for your baskets, and so many other utilitarian things. And the shags can be used for starting fires. And there is a home there for birds and for animals, and so on and so forth. So we describe some of those uses. And now we have a total of 28 different plants and trees signed on this trail. It's our longest trail and also the most difficult to walk. The next slide, please. And it ends at this brook, known as Great Brook, down on the west side of our property, on the west side of Boughton Hill. And we have a third trail, that goes to the top of Fort Hill, and I don't have slides of that with me. But that was where the granary was, and where there was a palisaded wall where people went for protection when they were under attack. We'll move quickly through these next couple of slides, or next few slides. One of the projects that we're undertaking at Ganondagan, and will start in 1997, is we're going to build a bark longhouse, like people lived in 300 years ago. It is going to be a big building. It will be 20 feet wide, 20 feet high, and 65 feet long. And it will be made out of the original materials, interior-wise, that were used in these bark longhouses. It will take nearly 1,800 poles to build the bark longhouse. And it will be covered with a material that will be so closely copied that you'll believe that it is elm bark, but it will actually be a synthetic product that will be cast from elm bark. And it will be an exhibit that you can walk inside of, and our goal is to have it look as though the residents of the house just left the house before you got there, and so now what you see is how they live in that house. And so that will start in '97 and will be built over the next 2 years. We're right now doing the work that has to be done to raise the money to be able to get this bark longhouse built. The next slide, please. These are, by the way, bark longhouses that are up in Milton, Ontario, at a place called Crawford Lake. This is just another example of the kind of structure we're actually going to build is going to have a peak roof. There were rounded roofs, you know, a barrel vault type roof, and there were also peak roofs. The one we're going to build is one that had a peak roof. The next slide. And by the way, the longhouse we're building is based on one that was actually excavated in 1965 by the Rochester Museum and Science Center. So we are using the floor plan of a known structure that was excavated completely. We don't have, you know, side elevation drawings. We just have some sketches by various people and descriptions that come from Europeans who visited these towns 300 years ago. The next slide. This is just another example of bark longhouses. And we'll go on to the next one. Just to show you one way in which the bark was laid on there, conceptually, just like the siding on your house, it's overlapping so that water will drain down it, and then you have poles on the outside which help to hold the bark on. So all of these things are, you know, for a purpose. The next slide. And originally, if we might have seen the Nondegan, you would have seen an arrangement of several bark longhouses all together. This was the work of the men. That was their responsibility. They were the builders, they were the repairmen, they were the manufacturers of all the tools that had to be used. They were the hunters, the gatherers, the defenders of their town. And so really the women did not do all the work. The men had many, many responsibilities, and men shared work with women. And the way in which we parceled out work was, let's say right now, okay, blackberries are beginning to ripen. The thing that you do is you mobilize as many people as you need, and you go and gather them because they're available now. This is when you're going to go and get them. When the corn is needing to be brought in, well, you get as many people together as you need to, and you go and get the corn. And you do it in a work party kind of a way, in a communal way, so that everybody does not have to do, you know, more work than anybody else. There's no one person that all the work is placed on, but the whole community divides up these jobs. That's the way in which our workforces focused their work so that they got it done, and then they had time to do the other things that were important to them. The next slide, please. I'm going to show quickly some slides of my work, and these are paintings done on handmade paper using acrylic and a variety of materials. And maybe you can see some of the symbolism again, the tree of peace, the white pine that I had mentioned earlier. That's what we call it, the tree of peace. And then the muskellunge here from the Allegheny River, and then the crow. Next slide, please. And this is another one. This one's called Strawberry Dance, and it's also done on handmade paper. And these are robins, of course, enjoying the strawberries as much as we do. And the next slide, please. And this one is one called Ansley's Fish. This is one done about my youngest son for the very first fish that he caught. And I do work on paper bags. Sometimes there are actual paper bags, sometimes there are flat pieces of paper that I fold to look like a paper bag, and sometimes they are handmade paper that I made and then I folded it into the shape of a paper bag. And it goes back to this concept of container, you know, and also that there can be 4 different sides that I can work on. You know, these are just 2 of them, and there's 2 other sides. They may have something related or unrelated, and they can tell a story. They're kind of autobiographical, each of them. The next slide, please. And this one is tough to see it maybe, but it's called White Dog Dream. There was a time when we used to actually sacrifice a dog as a part of our midwinter gathering. And this is going back to that time period, looking at the way in which the dog was prepared before sacrifice. The next slide. And then this one is kind of a political message. It says, "At the border, we look the same." And it's called At the Border. It's owned by the Rochester Museum and Science Center. And what it's about is that, we are divided now. Our people are divided by a river known as the Niagara River to us. But to you, there's the United States and there's Canada. And so we're divided by two countries now. But we have Haudenosaunee people that live at the Grand River in Canada, and we have Haudenosaunee people that live here. We speak the same languages. We are the same people. It's that those people who had allied themselves with the British went into Canada, what becomes Canada some years ago. And so when we go to the border and they say to us citizenship, we say Six Nations Iroquois. And they say, "Where are you going?" And we say, "We're going to the Six Nations Reserve, in Canada." Or if they're coming the other way, they say where they're going. So that's how we travel, by our identity as Haudenosaunee. And for example, I have traveled on our own passport. We issue our own passport. So when the Maori invited me to New Zealand, I traveled on a Haudenosaunee passport to New Zealand. The next slide. I think maybe the end right there. Yeah, okay. Now, I want to talk very quickly, turn the lights on, I guess, and hopefully it'll get cooler here. I'll make it quick. Let's see. What I wanted to say was, I was thinking about your concerns, and I was thinking about the importance of water. And so I wanted to to try to explain a little bit about how our people thought and how they still think and how we describe things. So for example, the way in which we describe our months is based on what's happening in that month. We talk about a month in which it's cold. It's just very, very cold. And that it is preceding a time when it's going to warm up again. There's even that thought in there. That's January for us. And we're talking about that's the time when it's going to start to get very, very bitterly cold. When we get towards spring, there's two different ways of describing those months. One is that water is running all over the place. Meaning, as it rains, the water accumulates and water begins to flow all over, and rivers overflow and creeks overflow and things like that. So we describe that. After that, we begin to describe that there are, or I should say even before that, before the rains get really heavy, we describe that there are peepers, and that you hear these peepers. But when you hear those peepers, it said, the first time you hear them, what they are announcing to you is that there's going to be one more snow. That there'll be one more snow after you hear them. And that when that snow kind of almost knocks them out, they'll come back even stronger. And you'll hear their voices much louder, and even more so than you did the first time you heard them. And that's how we describe that time period that goes between the beginning of the heavier rains that are going to take care of the plants that are going to come. So the people were looking at what is happening in their natural environment, and they were watching those things. Today I was taking a walk on that trail that I call the Earth is Our Mother Trail, and I was thinking how I was plodding through the woods, that my feet were loud in these sneakers as I walked along, and I was thinking how little I see compared to what my ancestors saw. That what they were looking for and what I was looking for are completely different. That even I do not understand fully what they thought of, what they saw as important, the signals that they recognized, the senses that they had developed, the sense for smell, of smelling things immediately that were around them. They hadn't destroyed their noses by many things that we have in our atmosphere now. They could smell things that were there, and they looked for those things. And they developed all of those skills that they saw in animals, for example, or that they saw in birds. They imitate the way animals walk, because if you walk like an animal in the woods, you don't alert all the animals in the woods that there's a human in the woods. And at a time in the past, we believed we even communicated with animals and birds. And maybe some of you have had that experience of feeling that you are communicating with an animal or communicating with a bird, or had an animal try to communicate with you. And our people, knowing that that was possible, took the time to listen and took the time to learn from what that bird or animal was telling them or showing them. And I'm not just saying this as, the most obvious things, that animals or birds do, but believing that they are truly teachers of our people. And that is a part of our way of thinking, and that we realize that animals and birds are gifts. They're gifts that were placed here by the Creator, and we enjoy them. And we think about, for example, the bird song. And I have heard it said by some of our speakers that the bird song is intended to prevent our loneliness. We could be lonely. We could be very depressed. But if we wake up in the morning and you hear those birds outside on a nice summer day like this, it's pretty hard to be depressed if you stop and think about the beauty of that song that you're hearing. And the fact that these birds know when to go away. They know when to go away as this part of the world begins to get cold. They know where to go. And they know how to come back, too, to the very same place that they left, and to find their way back here again. And so we think about that, too, that they have a knowledge that we do not have. They have a system of guiding themselves that we don't know about, but they have that. And so there's something to be learned from them. We think about the fact that those animals, some of them have been placed here for our food. People don't believe that. Some people think, it's a crime to take the white-tailed deer, but we believe they were actually placed here for our use, for our food. And now we have a problem because we're not using them. They're so overpopulated, they have no natural enemy. What are they going to do? Naturally they're going to reproduce beyond what they can be, what can even support them in some ways, and go into areas where they didn't normally go. And now the thing that's happening, which is very interesting, is that coming back are things that people thought were gone. Coyote. A coyote was hit down on Route 332 in Canandaigua and was brought to my house. So I saw it. It was definitely not a dog. I can tell you that right now. It was a coyote. And people are seeing coyotes. People are seeing cats. The bigger cats that they didn't think were around anymore, now they're coming around. So there are things that are out there that, we really shouldn't be fearful of them. I mean, they have a right to the same environment that we do, and they have been here for a very, very long time. But in our philosophy, it is said that we think they went away, but they're going to show themselves again. And at times will come and we'll see them along the edge of the woods. And so that's just what's happening now, is that we are beginning to see some of those come right back that people thought were long gone or wiped out or whatever they were. Even some of the fish that people thought were completely wiped out or were nearly destroyed by some of the pollution. When things got cleaned up a little bit, those fish come back again, and we see them again. So I believe that the world has a power, the natural world has a power to protect itself and to regenerate itself, but we also have a very destructive power in our hands, mankind does. And how do we control that? How do we modify that so that we don't destroy ourselves and everything else in the process? And the ones in this room who should be most concerned about what we do are the youngest ones that are here. Because there's a beautiful expression going around now that we are borrowing this world from our children, and that what they are going to have is how you and I manage this loan that we have. How we take care of it, how we act in a responsible manner toward it, and how individually we do that. Collectively, it can be even stronger, but how individually we think and how individually we act about these things. So I wouldn't say our people were ever perfect. I don't want to give you the impression that we were not filled with errors and didn't make mistakes, because certainly we did. But certainly the instructions we were given were intended to help us survive here, where you now live. And they helped us to survive here for a very long time, and even to survive until the present. It's almost amazing when you look at the East Coast, all the different Indian people that were once here, that you cannot find a single person of that group anymore here in the East Coast. And now you look and you can find the Seneca, you know where the Cayuga are, we know where the Onondaga live, we know where the Mohawks live, they're there still. And so we think that in part, it is because of those instructions we received about how we are to live with this environment, and that we are to recognize that everything we're given, the most important thing for us to do is to give thanks for it and to use it in a way in which we don't take it all for now and don't leave any for the future. We use it now only for our need, but then we allow that there's going to be something for the future.